The marble facade was freezing against my bare back, a sharp contrast to the fever heat radiating from Julianne's body. Her hands trapped me against the stone I had spent weeks polishing. Her breath hitched, warm and ragged against my neck, and for the first time since arriving at White Steel Estate, the structural integrity of the building didn't matter. The professional distance I had constructed was crumbling. But before the marble was smooth, before the heat threatened to burn the place down, there was only the cold. 3 months earlier, the iron gates groaned open, welcoming me into the wreckage. I drove my truck up the gravel drive, tires crunching over weeds that had claimed the path long ago. The estate didn't just look abandoned. It looked like a carcass picked clean by time. The air smelled of wet rot and ancient dust, a thick, heavy scent that coated my tongue and tasted like copper. I parked near a dry, cracked fountain, grabbed my tool belt, and looked up. The roof sagged in the center like a broken spine, dark windows staring back like empty sockets. It was a massive job, maybe too massive for one person, but the paycheck was enough to clear my debts twice over. I stepped through the missing front doors into the foyer. Debris crunched loudly under my work boots, echoing in the cavernous space. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the boarded windows, illuminating the scale of the decay. And there she was, standing in the center of the chaos, looking at a clipboard like she was inspecting a sterile lab rather than a disaster zone. Julianne. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my truck, her heels sharp enough to kill, blonde hair pulled back in a severe, perfect knot. She didn't look up when I cleared my throat. She just marked something on the paper with a gold pen, completely unaffected by the draft chilling the room. "You're late," she said, her voice cool and detached. She didn't check a watch, she just knew. "Gates were stuck," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I'm Rowan, the structural specialist." Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes were a piercing, icy blue, scanning me from my scuffed boots to the sawdust already clinging to my jeans. It wasn't a welcoming look. It was an appraisal, and I wasn't sure I passed. "I expected a team," she said, turning her back to me to survey the rotting staircase. "This house requires surgical precision, not a sledgehammer." "Sledgehammers are for demolition," I said, stepping closer, ignoring the way her perfume, expensive jasmine and cold steel, cut through the smell of mold. "I'm here for restoration. You want to save the bones, you need someone who knows how to set them without breaking the patient." She paused, the pen hovering. "The deadline is strict, Rowan. The gala is in 4 months. The East Wing needs to be structurally sound, the foyer restored to original condition, and the library operational. If you miss a milestone, the contract is void." 4 months is impossible for a crew, let alone one person, I countered, walking the perimeter. I ran a hand over the damp plaster. "The load-bearing walls are compromised. If I start shoring up the foundation without securing the roof, the vibration alone could bring the ceiling down. 4 months isn't just tight, it's reckless." "I don't pay for caution. I pay for results," she said, her gaze tracking my hand on the wall. "This estate has been in my family for 3 generations. It's rotting because of neglect. I intend to stop the bleeding. Can you do it? Or should I call the firm that wanted to gut it?" She knew exactly which buttons to push. "I can do it, but I do it my way. No micromanaging. I am an architect, Rowan. I don't micromanage. I oversee." She closed the distance between us. She was taller than I expected, her presence heavy. "You'll live on site. The guest cottage is habitable. I don't want time wasted on commuting. I want you breathing this building's air until it's fixed." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She handed me the clipboard, her fingers brushing mine, cool, dry, deliberate. "Don't make me regret hiring you." She walked away before I could answer, heels clicking a rhythm of absolute control. I spent the rest of the afternoon unloading gear, setting up lights in the gloom. Every beam I touched felt fragile. By the time I hauled my bags to the guest cottage, the sun had set. The cottage was drafty, windows rattling in the wind. I unpacked my few belongings, coffee pot, sketch pad, a photo of my dog, trying to make the space feel less like a cell. I looked out the window toward the main house. A single light burned in a second-floor window. I could see a silhouette there, rigid and unmoving, watching the grounds, watching me. The hair on my arms stood up, not from the cold, but from the distinct sensation of being analyzed. Julianne wasn't just the owner. She was the architect of this entire situation, and I was the foreign element she had introduced into her controlled experiment. I pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the view, but the feeling remained heavy in the room. I was inside her perimeter now, and I wasn't sure if I was the guest or the specimen. The first week wasn't restoration. It was triage. The house groaned under the weight of its own neglect, a low, constant complaining that only I seemed to hear. I spent 12 hours a day in the East Wing, bracing floor joists that had turned to sponge, and shoring up load-bearing walls that threatened to buckle if you looked at them wrong. It was dangerous, dirty work. My hands were constantly coated in gray dust and chalk, my muscles burning from hauling jack posts and lumber through the debris. I wasn't just fixing a building. I was suturing a wound that had been left open for decades, trying to stitch the skin back together before the infection reached the bone. Julianne was always there. She didn't hover. That would imply anxiety. She haunted. She would appear in doorways, silent as a shadow in those expensive suits, observing my progress with a critical eye. She never offered to help, which I expected, but she never left either. She treated the site like a laboratory, and me like a volatile chemical she needed to monitor. The test came on Tuesday. I was in the library, mixing a specific lime mortar for the cornice repair. The original plasterwork was delicate, a lost art of horsehair and lime that modern contractors usually ripped out and replaced with drywall. I was trying to save it. "That mix is too wet," Julianne's voice cut through the silence. She was standing 3 feet away, arms crossed, looking at my trough. "And the aggregate is too coarse. You'll ruin the profile." I didn't stop mixing. The rhythm was important. If I make it drier, it won't bond with the original lath. And the aggregate matches the 1890s repair, not the original 1840s installation. Someone tried to fix this 70 years ago. I have to match their work to keep the tension even, or the whole cornice cracks in 6 months. I finally looked up. She was frowning, her eyes darting from the bucket to the wall. She walked over, reaching out to touch the existing plaster, her manicured nail tracing a hairline fracture. She stayed there for a long moment, calculating the physics in her head. "The thermal expansion rates are different," she murmured, more to herself than me. "Exactly," I said, wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead with my forearm. "I'm building a bridge between the two eras. It has to be flexible." She looked at me then. Really looked at me. The icy appraisal thawed just a fraction, replaced by something sharper. Curiosity. "Proceed," she said simply. But she didn't walk away. That afternoon, the dynamic shifted. She stopped staring at the clipboard. She stopped staring at the walls. She started watching my hands. I was stripping layers of paint from the mahogany banister, the motion repetitive and rhythmic. I could feel her eyes on me, tracking the movement of my wrist, the flex of my forearm as I applied pressure. It wasn't the scrutiny of a boss checking for errors anymore. It felt heavy, tactile. When I paused to switch sandpaper, I caught her gaze. She didn't look away immediately. There was a beat of silence, thick with dust and something else, before she turned back to her blueprints. "It has good bones," she said suddenly, her voice softer than usual. "Under all the rot. The structure is defiant." "It's stubborn," I corrected, running a hand over the wood I'd just exposed. "It wants to stand. Most houses this neglected just give up. This one is fighting back." "I suppose that's why I kept it," she admitted. "I respect things that refuse to break." Later, I was hauling a heavy tarp down the narrow service hallway. The main corridor was blocked by scaffolding, forcing everyone, meaning me and her, into the tight servants' passages. I turned the corner and nearly ran into her. She froze. The hallway was barely wide enough for 2 people. "Excuse me," I muttered, shifting the tarp to my other shoulder, pressing my back against the peeling wallpaper to let her pass. She moved forward, but she didn't rush. As she squeezed past me, the air between us compressed. For a second, the sensory overload was dizzying. The sharp, pungent smell of old timber and damp plaster that clung to me was suddenly cut by her scent. Jasmine, cold rain, and something expensive and intoxicating. The heat of her body radiated through her silk blouse, brushing against the front of my work shirt. She was close enough that I could count the eyelashes framing those blue eyes. She paused, just for a heartbeat, trapped in the bottleneck with me. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up to my eyes. "Watch the paint," she whispered, though we were nowhere near wet paint. "Yes, ma'am," I breathed. She slipped past, the friction of her sleeve against my arm leaving a phantom burn. I stood there in the dim hallway for a full minute, clutching the dirty tarp, listening to her heels fade away. The dust was settling around me, but my pulse was hammering a different rhythm entirely. The house was stabilizing, but I was pretty sure I was starting to crack. The scaffolding was a skeleton built inside the house, a temporary rib cage of steel and pine, rising 30 feet into the stale air. Up here, the atmosphere shifted. It was hotter, the heat trapped against the vaulted ceiling, thick with dry rot and the metallic tang of the rusted chandelier chain. This was my domain. The ground floor belonged to Julianne and her clipboard, but the rafters belonged to me. I liked the isolation. I liked that the world narrowed to the 3 feet of planking beneath my boots and the damaged plasterwork in front of my face. It was a place where the rules of gravity were the only ones that mattered. I was removing water-damaged lath, dust drifting like gray snow, when the vibration started. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic tremor running up the metal poles, a deliberate ascent. I paused, my chisel hovering. No one came up here. The crew I'd hired had gone home hours ago. I leaned over the edge of the platform. Julianne was climbing the ladder. She wasn't dressed for it. She was wearing a silk blouse, the color of expensive champagne, and trousers that would be ruined by the dust. But she climbed with a surprising, athletic economy of movement. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look down. She pulled herself onto the narrow platform, bringing the scent of fresh air, rain, and sharp jasmine into my stagnant, dusty orbit. "The cornice," she said, slightly breathless but composing herself instantly. "I need to see the extent of the water intrusion before we approve the budget for the molding." "You could have used the drone footage," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans, suddenly conscious of how much space I took up. The platform was barely 4 feet wide. "I don't trust cameras," she replied, stepping closer. "I trust my eyes." She moved into my space, and the air pressure seemed to drop. Up here, there was no room for the polite fiction of personal space. To inspect the corner, she squeezed past me. I pressed my back against the cross bracing, making myself as small as possible, but it wasn't enough. As she maneuvered around me, the front of her body brushed against mine. It was a slow, inevitable friction. I felt the heat of her skin through the silk, a sudden, shocking warmth against my dust-caked work shirt. She didn't pull away. She paused, her eyes fixed on the rotting timber above us, but her body was aligned with mine, a parallel line that refused to intersect, but generated enough static to snap. "It's worse than the report said," she murmured, reaching up. "The rot goes deep," I said, my voice sounding rough in the quiet. "We have to cut it out." She turned to face me, and in the tight confines, the movement threw off the equilibrium. Her heel caught on a loose securing bolt. It was a small stumble, a momentary lapse in her perfect architecture, but at 30 feet up, a small lapse is a catastrophe. She pitched backward toward the rail. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I lunged. My hand shot out, grabbing her forearm, my fingers digging into the muscle. I yanked her forward, away from the edge, pulling her hard against me to kill her momentum. The plank beneath us groaned, shifting under the sudden redistribution of weight. We froze. My arm was wrapped around her waist, her hands clutching my shoulders, her face inches from mine. The silence was deafening. I could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that betrayed her calm exterior. I should have let go. The danger was past. She was steady. But my hands stayed on her waist, mapping the tension in her frame. Her grip on my shoulders didn't loosen. It tightened. Her fingers, usually so delicate with a pen, were strong, digging into the canvas of my jacket, anchoring herself to me. "You slipped," I whispered. It was a stupid thing to say. "I never slip," she countered, her voice low, vibrating in her chest against mine. She didn't move away. She looked at me with a terrifying intensity, her gaze dropping to my mouth and then back up, searching for something in the wreckage. "Why do you do this?" she asked suddenly, the question sharp and breathless. "Why spend your life in the dirt, fixing things that are already broken?" "Because they deserve to stand," I said, the truth of it raw in my throat. "Because someone has to care about the parts everyone else gave up on." Her expression fractured for a second, a crack in the marble facade. "And who fixes you, Rowan?" The question hung there, suspended in the dust motes dancing between us. I didn't have an answer. I just held her, the heat of her body seeping into mine, the line between architect and laborer blurring until we were just two women trapped in the sky. Finally, she exhaled, a long, shaky sound, and stepped back. The loss of contact was physical, a sudden cold snap. She smoothed her blouse, regaining her armor, but her hands were trembling. "The timber," she said, her voice crisp again, though her eyes were dark. "Replace it. All of it." She turned and began the descent, leaving me alone with the dust and the ghost of her touch burning on my skin. The site office was a converted parlor on the ground floor, the only room with reliable heat and electricity that didn't spark when the wind blew. Outside, the weather had turned vicious. Rain lashed against the tall French windows like handfuls of gravel, sealing us inside a capsule of warm light and the smell of ozone. It was past midnight. The rest of the crew had vanished hours ago, fleeing the storm to the safety of their homes in town. Julianne and I were still here, anchored by the sprawling blueprints of the West Wing spread across the heavy oak desk. The only light came from two brass banker's lamps, casting pools of gold on the cyan paper. The shadows in the corners of the room were deep, swallowing the furniture. It felt intimate, a closed ecosystem where the only sounds were the storm outside and the scratch of Julianne's pen against the paper. We were working in a silence that felt different from the heavy, dusty quiet of the hallways. This silence was electric, humming with the unspoken memory of the scaffolding earlier that day. Every time I pointed out a load-bearing issue, I could feel her breath hitch, just slightly. We were pretending nothing had happened, that we hadn't clung to each other 30 feet in the air, but the air between us was so thick you could lean against it. Julianne sighed, a sound of pure frustration, and dropped her pen. It rolled across the plans, coming to rest against my knuckles. "The structural calculations for the conservatory are a nightmare," she murmured, rubbing her temples. Her bun had loosened, strands of blonde hair curled against her neck. It made her look younger, softer. "We can reinforce the steel from the inside," I suggested, keeping my voice low. "Hide the support beams in the window mullions. It keeps the aesthetic, but adds the strength." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up and walked to the small sidebar in the corner. The clink of crystal against crystal rang out sharp and clear. She poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, the brandy swirling in the light, and brought them back to the desk. She slid one toward me. "Drink," she commanded softly. That wasn't a suggestion. I took the glass. The brandy smelled of burnt sugar and oak. I took a sip, the heat of it mirroring the heat that had been simmering in my chest for weeks. Julianne leaned back against the edge of the desk, crossing her arms, ignoring her chair. She looked down at me, swirling her glass. "My great-grandfather built this place to prove a point," she said, her eyes drifting to the dark window where the rain distorted the world. He wanted something that would outlast him. He didn't care about the cost or the practicality. He just wanted a legacy. She took a long swallow of the brandy. He didn't realize that a legacy is just a fancy word for a burden you can't put down. "Is that what this is to you?" I asked, turning in my chair to face her. "A burden?" "It's an obligation," she corrected. "I am the last of the line, Rowan. If this house falls, it falls on me. Everyone expects me to sell it, to let it become condos or a tax write-off. Fixing it, it's the only way I can prove I'm strong enough to carry the weight." "You don't have to carry it alone," I said. Julianne went still. She lowered her glass, her gaze snapping to mine. The professional mask was gone completely now, stripped away by exhaustion and the late hour. In the warm lamplight, her eyes weren't icy. They were turbulent, wide with a vulnerability she usually kept locked behind iron gates. She looked at me, really looked at me, tracing the line of my jaw, the dust on my collar, the calluses on the hand holding the crystal glass. "I don't know how to do anything else," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life building walls, not bridges." "That's why you hired me," I said, my voice barely above the sound of the rain. "I know how to shore up the weak spots." She set her glass down. She took a step toward me. The desk was the only thing separating us. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, pulling tight like a wire about to snap. I could smell that jasmine perfume again, warmer now, mixed with the brandy. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the arms of my chair, trapping me without touching me. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the gold flecks in her irises, the slight tremble in her lower lip. "And what if the weak spot is me?" she asked. My breath caught. The storm outside hammered against the glass, a crescendo of violence. But inside, the world had narrowed down to the pulse visible in her throat. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to smooth the worry from her forehead with my thumb. "Then we reinforced the foundation," I breathed. She didn't pull away. For a second, I thought she was going to close the gap. Her gaze dropped to my lips, lingering there with a hunger that terrified and thrilled me. The air was too thin to breathe. Then the thunder cracked, a massive, earth-shaking boom that rattled the teeth in my skull. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight that dropped onto us, pressing the air out of the room. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved, the ghost of our near touch still lingering in the charged space between us. Then, the practical reality of the old house asserted itself. "The sump pumps," Julianne said, her voice cutting through the dark, sharp and immediate. The vulnerability that had been swimming in her eyes a second ago vanished, replaced by the steel spine of the owner. If the basement floods, the foundation work is ruined. And the east wing tarps, if that wind shifts, we lose the plaster. "I'll check the breakers," I said, already fumbling for my phone. The flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, catching the dust motes swirling in the stagnant air like confused stars. "You check the east wing. If a tarp is loose, don't try to secure it alone. Wait for me." "Go," she commanded, already moving toward the door, her heels clicking a fast, blind rhythm on the hardwood. We moved. The house, usually a place of quiet decay, was alive with the storm. I ran through the service corridors, the beam of my light bouncing off peeling wallpaper and shrouded furniture that looked like crouching beasts. I could hear the house groaning, the timbers shifting under the assault of the wind, a low moan that vibrated through the floorboards. I secured the breakers, confirming the grid was down, and ran to find her. She was in the east wing, battling a nightmare. A heavy canvas tarp had torn loose from the window frame where the glass was missing. Rain was lashing in, horizontal and vicious, soaking the floor, soaking the exposed lath, soaking her. She was drenched, her silk blouse clinging to her skin, wrestling with the heavy, wind-whipped fabric like it was a wild animal. The wind howled through the opening, screaming like a banshee. "Grab the corner!" I yelled over the wind, diving in to help. I grabbed the wet, slippery canvas, my boots skidding on the slick floor. The wind possessed the tarp, snapping it with enough force to break a finger. We hauled it back together, shoulder to shoulder, fighting the gale that tried to rip it from our hands. My fingers were numb, slippery with rain, but we managed to hook the heavy brass grommets back onto the iron frame. We slammed the storm shutters, engaging the heavy latch with a final, metallic clank. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. We stood there in the dark hallway, chests heaving, water dripping from our clothes onto the floorboards, shivering in the sudden drop in temperature. The beam of my flashlight sat on the floor, casting long, weird shadows up the walls. "The library!" she gasped, pushing wet hair out of her eyes. Her hands were shaking. "The fireplace works. It's the only warm room." We retreated to the library like soldiers falling back to a final stronghold. I got the fire started while she found towels in a cabinet. The dry wood caught quickly, the flames licking up the chimney and casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of books. The room warmed, smelling of wood smoke and old paper. Julianne sat on the leather sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring into the fire. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed exhaustion. I sat on the floor near the hearth, the warmth of the fire on my face, the chill of the damp house at my back. I watched the firelight play across her features. She looked small in the blanket, stripped of her architectural armor. "I hate this," she whispered. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the flames consume the log. "The storm?" I asked softly, wringing water from my shirt cuff. "The lack of control," she said, turning to me. The firelight caught the water still clinging to her eyelashes, turning them into diamonds. "I build things, Rowan. I structure the world so it makes sense. I create perimeters and load pads and safety factors, but tonight, the power goes out, the roof leaks, and I'm just helpless. I'm just a woman in the dark, waiting for the roof to cave in." "You weren't helpless," I said, shifting closer on the rug. "You saved the East Wing. You didn't wait for the roof to cave in. You went out into the rain and held it up with your bare hands." She looked at me then, her eyes wide and dark in the flickering light. "I was terrified," she admitted, the confession barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Fear is structural," I told her, holding her gaze. "It tells you where the load is too heavy. It doesn't mean you're going to break. It just means you're carrying a lot." The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and the undeniable pull of gravity. She reached a hand out from the blanket. It hovered in the space between us, trembling slightly. I reached up, my fingers brushing hers, a ghost of a touch, electric and terrifying. Her skin was cold, but the heat radiating from her was enough to burn. "Rowan," she breathed, her gaze dropping to my lips. I leaned in. The world narrowed to the firelight reflecting in her eyes. I could smell the rain on her skin, taste the anticipation on my tongue. Then, with a violent, audible crack, the overhead chandelier blazed to life. The harsh, artificial light flooded the room, bleaching out the shadows, the intimacy, and the moment. We sprang apart like we'd been scalded. Julianne flinched, the vulnerability vanishing instantly behind a mask of shock. She pulled the blanket tighter, her posture straightening into a rigid line. The sanctuary was gone. The architect was back. The electricity was back, humming with an aggressive, artificial consistency. But the delicate connection between us had been severed completely. When I walked into the kitchen the next morning, the air felt refrigerated. Julianne was already there, pouring coffee. She was wearing a suit so sharp it could cut glass. Navy blue, high collar, not a single hair out of place. The vulnerable woman who had huddled under a wool blanket and confessed her fears was gone. In her place stood the architect, a woman built of steel beams and reinforced concrete, designed to repel intruders. She didn't say good morning. She didn't even look at me. She just slid a revised punch list across the granite island. It hit the counter with a slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The molding in the east corridor is unacceptable," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all inflection. "The grain doesn't align with the door frames. Tear it out and redo it." I stared at the paper, then at her. "The grain is a perfect match. I hand-selected those boards myself. If I tear them out, we lose 3 days." "Then work nights," she said, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were dead. No heat, no storm. Just a flat blue surface. "I'm not paying for good enough, Rowan. I'm paying for perfection. If you can't deliver that, perhaps I miscalculated your utility." Utility. The word landed like a physical blow. Last night, I was a confidant, a partner in the dark. This morning, I was a tool to be used and discarded. I swallowed the hurt, letting it curdle into irritation. "I'll check it," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I'm not tearing out good work just because you're having a mood swing." Her jaw tightened. "I don't have mood swings. I have standards." It got worse. For the next 3 days, she was a phantom of criticism. She shadowed my every move, finding faults that didn't exist. She criticized the mix of the mortar, the shade of the primer, the way I organized my tools. It was a systematic dismantling of my confidence, a deliberate attempt to reestablish the hierarchy. She needed to be the boss, so she didn't have to be the woman who almost kissed me. The breaking point came on Thursday. We were standing in the grand foyer, arguing over the plans for the main staircase facing. The original design called for the local limestone to be cleaned and restored, a warm, honey-colored stone that held the history of the house. Julianne had marked up the blueprints with aggressive red ink, crossing out "restore" and writing "replace, Carrara marble." "You can't be serious," I said, slamming the roll of drawings down on a sawhorse. Dust puffed up between us. "Marble? In a Gothic revival farmhouse? It'll look like a mausoleum. It's cold, it's sterile, and it clashes with everything we've done." "It's clean," she snapped, crossing her arms. "It's durable. And unlike this rotting limestone, it doesn't crumble when you touch it." "The limestone isn't rotting, it's breathing," I shouted, my patience finally snapping. "It has character. It has flaws. That's what makes it beautiful. You can't just pave over everything with white marble because you're afraid of a little texture." "I am not afraid of texture," she yelled back, her composure finally cracking. "I am trying to save this building from falling apart." "No, you're not." I stepped into her space. The anger was boiling over now, fueled by 3 days of silence and the memory of her trembling hand in the dark. "You're trying to turn this house into something it's not. You're trying to make it hard and cold and untouchable. Just like you." She flinched. It was microscopic, a tiny widening of the eyes. But I saw it. "You're terrified," I pushed on, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "You let your guard down for 5 minutes in the library, and it scared you so much you're trying to retrofit your entire life with marble so no one can ever get in again. You're not fixing the house, Julianne. You're building a bunker." "You are an employee," she hissed, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You are here to execute my vision, not to psychoanalyze me. If I want marble, you will lay marble. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, backing away, shaking my head. "I understand that you'd rather ruin something beautiful than risk letting it be real." I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I marched straight to the guest cottage, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The silence that followed wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was the silence of a battlefield after the shooting stops. For the next 48 hours, we didn't speak. I worked on the staircase, grinding the limestone with aggressive, loud machinery, refusing to look at the marble samples she'd left on the floor. She stayed in her office or the upper floors, a ghost haunting her own halls. The air in the house grew heavy, pressurized, like the atmosphere before a tornado touches down. We were occupying the same coordinates, but we were worlds apart, separated by a wall of pride and fear that was thicker than any stone I could ever lay. The deadline wasn't a date on a calendar anymore. It was a guillotine blade hovering inches above our necks. The gala was 4 days away. The house was buzzing with a chaotic energy during the daylight hours. Caterers doing walkthroughs with measuring tapes, electricians testing the exterior floods until my retinas burned, landscapers fighting a losing battle with the overgrown hedges that threatened to swallow the driveway. But at 2 a.m., the house was silent, save for the high-pitched, screaming whine of my angle grinder. I was alone in the grand foyer, on my knees at the base of the staircase. I had won the argument about the limestone, but the victory felt hollow, like ash in my mouth. Now, I had to prove it was worth saving. I was polishing the bottom step, the stone warm under my gloved hands, stripping away decades of grime and neglect to reveal the honey-colored fossilization beneath. My arms vibrated with the force of the machine, a numbness that had settled into my bones days ago and refused to leave. I was exhausted, fueled only by bitter, lukewarm coffee and a stubborn refusal to let Julianne see me crack. I was grinding down the stone, but I felt like I was grinding down myself. I didn't hear her approach. The grinder was too loud, drowning out the world, creating a bubble of noise that kept my thoughts at bay. I only knew she was there because the hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal warning system that had nothing to do with construction safety and everything to do with the magnetic field she seemed to generate. I switched off the grinder. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, ringing in my ears like a physical pressure. I didn't turn around immediately. I took a slow breath, smelling the stone dust that hung in the air like a fog, mixing with the inevitable scent of jasmine that signaled her perimeter. "You're working late," she said. Her voice was low, echoing slightly in the cavernous space. I pulled off my safety goggles, blinking against the sudden sting of the dust, and turned. Julianne was standing near the double doors, half in shadow. She wasn't wearing the armor of her tailored suits tonight. She was in a silk robe, dark as midnight, tied tightly at the waist. Her hair was down, a rare, chaotic cascade over her shoulders that softened the sharp angles of her face. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life, sleepless and restless. "Deadline doesn't care what time it is," I said, my voice rasping from the dust. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, sending a cloud of white powder into the air between us. "And since you insisted on a final inspection tomorrow morning, I'm making sure there's nothing for you to tear apart." "I don't tear things apart for sport, Rowan," she said, stepping out of the shadows. Her eyes were dark, circled by exhaustion that mirrored my own. "I do it for quality." "You do it for control," I shot back. I was too tired for the polite dance. "You've been hovering over me for 3 days, Julianne. You check my work before the dust even settles. You remeasure my cuts. You stand in the doorway and watch me breathe." I took a step toward her, the frustration boiling over. "If you don't trust me to finish this, then fire me. Pay out the contract and I'll pack my truck right now." She flinched, her composure cracking. "Don't be ridiculous. The gala is in 4 days." "Then tell me what the problem is," I demanded, my voice rising, bouncing off the high ceilings. "Because it's not the limestone. It's not the mortar mix. It's not the structural integrity of the east wing. I have fixed every broken thing in this house, but you look at me like I'm the one swinging the wrecking ball." "You are," she whispered. The admission stopped me cold. "What?" "You are wrecking everything," she said, her voice gaining strength, sharp and accusatory. She closed the distance between us, ignoring the dust, ignoring the barrier of professional distance we had tried to rebuild. "I can't think, Rowan. I can't focus. I sit in my office and stare at blueprints, but I'm listening for your boots in the hall. I'm checking the time to see if you're still working. I'm pouring brandy I don't want just to stop my hands from shaking. She stopped 3 feet from me, her chest heaving. The anger in her eyes was real, but beneath it was something else, something desperate and starving. I'm not trying to distract you, I said quietly, my heart hammering against my ribs. You don't have to try, she snapped. You just exist. You're here, in my house, breathing my air, covering everything in dust and life. You're loud and you're messy and you refuse to be managed. She took another step, invading my personal space. The heat coming off her was palpable. I told you I needed to stop the bleeding, but you didn't just stitch the wound, Rowan. You opened a vein. Julianne, I warned, though I didn't know what I was warning her against. I wanted marble because it's cold, she confessed, the words tumbling out now. I wanted stone because it doesn't feel anything. But you... Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes, dilated and dark. You make everything feel. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The anger that had been driving her seemed to morph, twisting into something predatory. She wasn't the cold, distant architect anymore. She was a woman who had spent months starving herself of connection, and she was done waiting for permission to eat. She stepped closer, her silk robe brushing against my dusty work clothes. She didn't care about the mess. She didn't care about the house. The distance between us vanished, replaced by a magnetic pull that was terrifying in its intensity. Tell me to leave, I whispered, giving her one last out. Tell me to go, and I will. No, she breathed, her eyes locking onto mine. You're not going anywhere. She moved like a storm front, inevitable and destructive. I took a step back, my boots sliding slightly on the layer of stone dust I had created. Then another step. I was retreating, ceding ground I had spent months fighting for, because the look in Julianne's eyes wasn't something I knew how to defend against. It wasn't the calculated gaze of the client or the critical glare of the architect. It was raw, stripped of all the blueprints and structural safety factors she clung to. You don't get to decide when this is over, she said, her voice low and vibrating with a tension that had been building since the day I arrived. You don't get to walk in here, tear down my walls, expose everything I've tried to keep hidden, and then just pack up your truck because it got too real. I took another step back, and my shoulder blades collided with the cold, hard surface of the foyer wall. It was one of the original marble pilasters, smooth and unforgiving against my work shirt. The shock of the cold stones snapped my head up, but there was nowhere to go. Julianne was there instantly, closing the final inch of distance. She didn't stop until her body was pressed against mine, trapping me between the freezing marble and the fever heat radiating from her skin. She slammed her hands against the stone on either side of my head, boxing me in. The sound of her palms hitting the marble echoed like a gunshot in the empty, high-ceilinged room. I was paralyzed, pinned by the sheer force of her presence. The air between us was gone, replaced by the scent of her, that sharp, expensive jasmine, now mixed with the metallic tang of adrenaline and the dusty, ancient smell of the house we were both trying to save. My breath hitched, loud and ragged in the silence. I looked at her, really looked at her. The composure was shattered. Her chest was heaving, rising and falling against mine, with a rhythm that matched my own racing heart. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the icy blue, turning her gaze into something dark and infinite. Julianne, I whispered, the name catching in my throat. What are you doing? I'm taking control, she breathed, her voice trembling but fierce. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, her breath hot on my skin. You said I was afraid to let things be real. You said I wanted a bunker. She shifted, her knee pressing between my legs, a sudden grounding weight that made my knees buckle. You were right. I was terrified. But I'm not building a bunker anymore, Rowan. I'm claiming what belongs to me. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. Her hands slid down from the wall to grip my shoulders, her fingers digging into the muscle, anchoring herself to me as if I were the only solid thing in a world of crumbling plaster. "This building is mine," she said, the words distinct and heavy, landing with the weight of a final verdict. "And so are you." The tension in the room didn't just break, it shattered. The fight went out of me in a rush of air, replaced instantly by a hunger so sharp it hurt. I didn't argue. I didn't pull away. I surrendered. "Then prove it," I challenged, a desperate whisper. She didn't hesitate. She crashed her mouth onto mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't the tentative exploration of two people testing the waters. It was a collision. It was desperate and messy and overwhelming. It tasted of brandy and mint and months of suppressed desire. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, demanding a response I was all too ready to give. I groaned, the sound lost against her lips, and wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her flush against me. The silk of her robe was slippery under my dust-coated hands, a sensory contradiction that made my head spin, the rough grit of my work gloves against the delicate fabric of her life. She kissed me like she was trying to breathe for the first time in years. There was anger in it, yes, but beneath the anger was a profound relief, a frantic need to bridge the gap she had so carefully constructed. I felt her teeth graze my lip, felt the desperate slide of her tongue, and I met her with everything I had. I kissed her back with all the frustration of the past 3 months, with all the unspoken words and the stolen glances and the late nights spent thinking about this exact moment. We were a tangle of limbs and heat against the cold marble. The house around us, the half-finished stairs, the exposed beams, the piles of debris, faded into nothing. There was only the friction of her body against mine, the sound of our ragged breathing, and the taste of her mouth. I felt her hands roaming over me, mapping the muscles of my back, gripping my waist, claiming every inch of space I had tried to keep separate. For a long, suspended moment, time didn't exist. There was no deadline, no gala, no crumbling estate, just the architect and the builder, finally finding the same rhythm. Then, slowly, the frantic energy began to ebb, replaced by a heavy, languid heat. Julianne pulled back, just an inch. Her forehead rested against mine again. Her eyes were closed, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks. Her lips were swollen, red and wet. She was trembling, a fine vibration running through her frame that I could feel in my own bones. We stood there in the silence of the foyer, breathing the same air, the dust settling around us like snow. The reality of what we had just done and what it meant began to seep back in, but for once, neither of us moved to rebuild the wall. We just stood there, leaning on each other, letting the foundation settle. The morning after the foyer, the silence in the kitchen was companionable. Julianne didn't wear her armor. She wore tailored jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, meeting me not with a clipboard, but with 2 mugs of black coffee. She slid one across the granite island, her fingers lingering on the ceramic handle for a second longer than necessary. "Show me," she said, gesturing to the limestone samples spread out on the counter. "Show me exactly why it breathes." The final 4 days weren't a panic. They were a partnership. The rigid hierarchy of architect and laborer dissolved into something fluid and shared. We finished the grand staircase together, side by side on our knees in the dust. I guided her hands over the stone, teaching her the specific pressure needed to apply the sealant without choking the natural grain. Her hands, usually accustomed to gold pens and crystal, learned the rougher, honest language of the work. We spent hours in the library, not arguing over plans, but polishing the mahogany panels until they glowed like dark fire. It was intimate work, the repetitive motion sinking our breathing. The silence filled not with tension, but with a shared purpose. When she wiped a smudge of dust from my cheek with her thumb, it wasn't a seduction. It was an acknowledgement that we were made of the same earth. The house seemed to sense the change. The creaks and groans of the settling timber quieted, replaced by the solid, resonant hum of a structure that had been loved back to life. We weren't just fixing a building anymore. We were inhabiting it. The night of the gala, White Steel Estate looked like a resurrection. The crystal chandeliers blazed, throwing complex prisms of light onto the polished floors we had labored over. The air smelled of fresh beeswax, expensive perfume, and the faint underlying scent of old timber that gave the place its soul. Guests and investors drifted through the rooms, marveling at the transformation. They talked about the miraculous turnaround and the visionary architecture. They saw the surface. They didn't see the sweat, the fear, or the late-night brandy that had actually held the place together. I stood on the terrace, escaping the crush of the crowd. I was wearing a charcoal suit Julianne had insisted on buying, feeling like an imposter until a hand slid into mine. Julianne stood beside me, radiant in gold silk that shimmered like liquid metal. She looked like the queen of her castle, but her grip on my hand was tight, grounding. "They're impressed," I said, nodding toward the crowd behind the glass doors. "They see the paint," she replied, turning her back on the adulation to look out at the dark, sprawling grounds. "They don't know about the rot we had to cut out. They don't know how close the roof came to caving in during the storm." "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said, squeezing my fingers, "because I know who held the flashlight when the power went out." She turned to face me. The party noise faded into a dull roar, irrelevant against the silence of the terrace. The air out here was cool, smelling of rain and the jasmine that was now permanently etched into my senses. "The contract is technically complete," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "The house is restored. You're free to go." "Is that an eviction notice?" I asked, though my pulse remained steady. I knew the answer in the way she leaned toward me. "It's a renegotiation," she smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached those blue eyes. "I have a new project. It's a long-term restoration, decades probably. High maintenance, stubborn foundation, prone to putting up walls." "Sounds expensive," I teased, stepping into her space. "Cost is irrelevant," she whispered, lifting her hand to rest on my lapel. "I'm investing in the future." We stood there on the terrace, the house standing strong behind us, the future unwritten before us. We didn't know exactly what the next blueprint looked like, but we knew we were drawing it together. 3 long months ago, the heavy iron gates of White Steel Estate had groaned open to let a stranger into the wreckage. Tonight, as the last guest cars rolled away, those gates clicked shut with a satisfying finality. But this time, I wasn't on the outside. I was inside, knowing the cold was gone for good. The building finally stood strong, and so did the connection we built within it. If you want to see what other walls we tear down together, hit subscribe.